Ja, einen schönen guten Abend allerseits. Wir warten noch kurz, bis sich die Audiosignale und Videosignale verbunden haben. Deswegen haben Sie noch kurz 30 Sekunden Geduld mit uns. Wir sind aber hier und startklar. Und jeder, der noch dazukommen möchte, wird auch noch reingelassen. Also keine Sorge. Und wir lassen Sie auch wieder rein, falls Sie mal rausfliegen sollten. Bitte machen Sie alle Ihre Audiofunktion aus, damit die Audioqualität für alle gesichert ist. Das gibt sonst immer so Störsenderfunktionen. Okay, ich glaube, wir können anfangen. Herzlich willkommen im virtuellen Veranstaltungsraum des Karl-Schurz-Hauses. Ich bin René Freudenthal vom Deutsch-Amerikanischen Institut und begleite Sie heute Abend durch Lesung und Gespräch mit Catherine Belton über Putins People, Putins Netz auf Deutsch. Ja, worum geht es? Das sage ich ganz kurz und stelle Ihnen die Autorin vor. Als am vielproklamierten Ende der Geschichte die Sowjetunion kollabierte, ahnte niemand, dass ein blasser, früherer KGB-Agent, nicht Akzent, sich für Jahrzehnte als russischer Präsident behaupten würde. Doch ein Alleinherrscher ist Wladimir Putin nicht. Seine Macht stützt sich auch in Fragen von Krieg und Frieden auf ein Netzwerk von Top-Geheimdienstlern, deren Einflussnahme weit über Russland hinausreicht und die als revanchistische neue Elite nach einer wiederhergestellten Großmachtstellung greifen. Was plant Putin wirklich und was und wer hat ihn geprägt, seit er als Spion in Dresden gearbeitet hat, als die Mauer fiel, der Ostblock zerbrach und die berühmt gewordene Anekdote von ihm in die Welt kam, nämlich dass Moskau schwieg. Die renommierte Investigativ-Journalistin Catherine Belton hat für ihr weltweit viel beachtetes Sachbuch Putins Netz, wie sich der KGB Russland zurückholte und dann den Westen ins Auge fasste, erschien bei HarperCollins in Deutschland, mit einstigen Kreml-Insidern über den Tyrannen gesprochen. Und heute Abend spricht sie mit uns über ihre Recherchen in Putins engsten Zirkeln und skizziert, wie die Granden des sowjetischen KGB den Fall der Supermacht überstanden und sich nach den 90ern daran machten, einen der ihren als Potentaten zu installieren und sich Russland zurückzuholen. Catherine Belton berichtete von 2007 bis 2013 als Auslandskorrespondentin für die Financial Times aus Moskau und arbeitet heute als Investigativreporterin für die Nachrichtenagentur Reuters. And with that, I'm delighted to speak to you today, Catherine Belton.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor to speak to you all this evening. Thank you.
There was a lot of German in the beginning, but now we're going to switch to English. And it might be a cliche, but your 640-page book, Putin's People, does kind of resemble a classic Russian novel in its sheer scope. Its incredibly wide cast of characters. There are literally hundreds of names of people you very astutely characterize and put in context, but there's a lot of names. And at the center of this intricate web, Netz is the title in German as well, a little bit different than in the original, sits Putin, like a giant black spider pulling all the threads. And so before we delve into this remarkable and terrifying narrative, I was gonna ask you, how did you conceive of this book and start reporting it? Because I imagined you at some points like Carrie Matheson in the show Homeland, just draw boards with pictures and names and clippings of newspapers.
Well, you know, I was lucky to work as a correspondent in Moscow for many years, and it began as a completely different book. When I was first working in Moscow, I was working with the Moscow Times, and I was covering very, very closely every day the state takeover of Mikhail Khodorkovsky's Yukos oil company. And my initial ambition was to write a book about that because it was a real turning point for the Russian economy. It was the end of the freedom of the Yeltsin era and the end of any independence really for the Russian oligarchs. They were no longer oligarchs. But then I was going to work on that. Then I got offered a job with the Financial Times in Moscow, so I put it to one side. And then, as my editors were saying in 2012, a long time ago now, it's time to come back to London. You should write about private equity. I thought, you know, that's really a waste, because I've been now in Moscow for many years, and particularly at the Financial Times. I built relationships with many of Russia's kind of billionaires and members of government and former senior Kremlin officials. And I just really thought that I would like to resurrect my book idea, but write it this time about the group of people who replaced Khodorkovsky. So there was going to be Khodorkovsky and then Putin's men, the new oligarchs who took over the economy. And that was my initial idea. But as I researched it, I realized that there was a lot that we didn't understand about the security services. And most of the Putin era tycoons who elbowed out the likes of Khodorkovsky or others, they all had some connections with the KGB one way or another. And I really wanted to understand how and why they operated. And it was the case that Putin was running the economy like a spy chief. He had a network of loyal allies who were in charge of various strategic sectors of the economy, and each had its own turf, but he was the one, as you say, like the spider in the middle. And I was just trying to understand kind of why they had this modus of operation and what was behind their mindset. And it seemed to me that was really deeply rooted in his background in the KGB. And the more that I researched what happened at the Soviet collapse and what Putin was doing in St. Petersburg, the more the kind of the pieces seemed to fit together.
Mm. So after the prologue to the book, you go about telling the story mostly chronologically, of course, with flashbacks to give more context. But we begin in this miserable winter of 1992. That's very evocative. The Soviet Union has just ceased to exist, something we really don't think about in the West a lot, at least before this current crisis. Hyperinflation and the economy in ruins are destabilizing this young democracy. Boris Yeltsin is, of course, the first elected president. And we meet in your book in the beginning St. Petersburg's, former Leningrad's, ambitious, slightly robotic young mayor, deputy mayor, as I should say, not even the mayor yet, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, and his stunning rise in just a decade from a nobody, KGB agent more or less, to the chosen successor to the ailing Yeltsin, will be intimately linked to the KGB agents, of course, as you said, but also to the Yeltsin family, who's looking for someone who can protect them after Yeltsin will fade from power and from view. So could you take us with you on this chaotic time after the fall of the Soviet Union and explain how this unlikely heir made his way to the presidency?
Yeah, I was very lucky because that description at the beginning of Putin in 92, when he's he's just been made deputy mayor, the economy is imploding. I could get such a very vivid picture of what was happening then, because I met the head of a TV program, Igor Shadkhan, who had done the first ever interview with Putin when he was deputy mayor. It was his first ever TV interview. Putin was introducing himself to the people of St. Petersburg. And there was, in that interview, there were all the pictures of St. Petersburg as it was then, the queues of people on the street, everyone huddled against the icy wind and the lack of goods in the shops. And it was a really kind of evocative video, because Putin, one, showed himself to have this tremendous grasp and command of detail. He knew exactly what needed to be done to organize the transition to the market economy. And he also gave some giveaway signs for what we're seeing precisely today. He spoke again then of the Soviet Union's collapse as being a tragedy. And he also spoke about how the Bolsheviks were to blame for the tragedy that we're experiencing today, because it was the Bolsheviks who tore the country up, who tore the empire up into countries that didn't and shouldn't exist, like Ukraine, for instance, that they created these artificial borders. So even then he had this hankering for Russian empire, and he believed that the communists had really let down the empire. And in a way, he was among this kind of contingent of security service people who thought that communism, planned economy had failed the empire, that this is what had led them to being unable to compete directly with the West militarily or economically. So they were kind of going full force for this market transition. And yeah, it was a really interesting moment. And but so Putin, I was interested in what Putin was doing in St. Petersburg as deputy mayor. It turned out, as I reported, that his key function was to be liaison with the other sort of members of the security service establishment. Many of his old friends from the Leningrad KGB were running the FSB, the KGB successor agency, and together he really joined forces there with them to take control there of strategic sectors of the economy. They had a battle, though. They had to fight off organized crime to do so. At the time, St. Petersburg, more than any other cities, had been engulfed in a wave of organized crime, and they'd taken over the city's most strategic asset, which was its seaport and its oil terminal. And Putin immediately understood the significance. And he, with his close friend and KGB ally, Gennady Timchenko, they were trying to create their own oil terminal that was outside of the control of the organized crime. But that actually got them into hot water. The organized crime group began going after Putin as well. Putin feared for his family's safety to such a degree that he sent his daughters to Germany under the care of Matthias Warnig, who had been his friend since the Dresden KGB days. And in the end, though, they just made a kind of another crucial decision, which we can point to signposts for the Putin that we see today. They decided that in the end, they couldn't beat the organized crime, so they would join them. And they joined forces with the most powerful group, the Tambov organized crime group. You can see that in some of the ownership of the St. Petersburg seaport and the oil terminal. His friend Gennady Timchenko ended up with a monopoly on exports through the oil terminal, but it was owned by kind of a close cohort of the Tambov organized crime group, a guy called Ilya Traba and some of his associates. So they joined forces at a very early stage. And there was one former Moscow KGB officer who was going to join them then in business. And he was trying to do the oil terminal project with them. But at that point, he backed off because he realized that St. Petersburg KGB, they were much, much more ruthless than the Moscow KGB. And he would never, for instance, the Moscow KGB guy said he would never work with organized crime. He didn't want to get his hands dirty. But he said the St. Petersburg KGB, they're much more ruthless. They have a chip on their shoulder. They have an inferiority complex because they're from Russia's second city, not the capital. People think they're less educated. So they're much more willing to do anything to grab hold of power. And I guess this is what we see today in the clan of St. Petersburg KGB men that Putin has brought with him to power. We see them much more willing to tear up the rule book and act so aggressively as we've seen so tragically in Ukraine. So that was a big signpost. And then the other interesting thing of Putin in St. Petersburg was everyone knows about the oil for food deals. This was the first big scandal of his career. It's always been seen as kind of a pure kleptocracy for most of the time. This was Putin handing out export licenses to trade commodities for vitally needed imports of food. Like hyperinflation was raging, prices had just been liberalized, so supply chains had completely broken down. St. Petersburg was out of food, and Putin was meant to organize this scheme to bring in food supplies, but he handed out $92 million worth of licenses to crony companies. The food didn't turn up, and everyone always thought that this was just an example of Putin lining his friends' pockets. But if you looked a bit more closely, this was another interesting early moment in my research. I found this former KGB officer who worked with Putin on designing the deals, and he said it was a bit more complicated than that, because at the time, Russia had taken on all the debts of the Soviet Union and then pronounced itself bankrupt. So officially there was a moratorium on paying any debts at all, and all Russia's official foreign bank accounts were frozen. So they needed to create stashes of cash abroad in places like Liechtenstein and other havens so that they could continue to pay for vitally needed equipment supplies for St. Petersburg, and so that they could continue to pay off some of the debts under grey schemes, some of which were connected to KGB operations, because in Soviet times, the KGB had been funded by so-called friendly firms, which supplied equipment to the Soviet Union at vastly inflated prices. And they would keep the difference and use it to fund KGB black ops or more official political operations or Communist Party campaigns. And some of these debts needed to be paid. And this former KGB officer very clearly said, and you could see that he was working closely with the friendly firms. He said, we needed to create these flows of money so that we could pay the friendly firms, because we couldn't say, we're not paying Philip Morris, but we're paying like these guys on the side. We needed to create these black channels of cash that no one would notice. So the funds that were accumulating from the commodity deals did not go for imports of food, but they didn't entirely go just to line Putin's friends' pockets. They were kind of creating an unofficial slush fund for the city so it could pay for things, but they were also to keep the intelligence networks going as well. And that was sort of, you could see that as like an early germ for how Putin operated much later on a federal scale. Like he gave out the economy to his close, trusted, loyal allies, mostly connected to the KGB, and they in turn created enormous slush funds, which they then used for strategic operations. It was never purely about building palaces or owning yachts. It was a means of power, politics, and also to kind of deploy influence in operations abroad as well.
Yeah, and the links between basically the secret services, or what's left of them, and organized crime are really a red thread in the book, and it's quite shocking how well they work together. But the 90s are also the high times of the initial ranks of the newly bred oligarchs that profited from market liberation, basically from market reform by Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and selling off state assets. They became billionaires overnight, more or less. It feels like a Wild West situation in your book sometimes. And one of them was your top source for the book, the entrepreneur, banker, and later shipbuilding mogul, Sergei Pugachev, was quite important to Putin's rise, actually. He helped him along quite a bit. Could you tell us a little bit more about his role in this epic story you tell, and about the tense relations between this old KGB elite that felt reprehended and shoved off the scenery, basically, and the new elite of money oligarchs in Yeltsin's times?
Yes, I think so. The KGB for a while had tried to keep control of oil exports, even as Russia headed into this crazy time of privatization. For the first half of the 90s, the oil industry was still controlled by the so-called red directors, and they sold their oil mostly through so-called spецэкспортеры, and they were all in some way or another linked with foreign intelligence services and so on. And that's how they managed to get these special licenses. There were only a handful of them, maybe half a dozen or 8 maximum. And they got special licenses from the Yeltsin administration to trade oil. And they did so because of their closeness to the security services. But when in the mid-90s, the Yeltsin government completely ran out of cash, they turned to these young bankers who had created the country's first banks and were holding the government's treasury accounts and making huge amounts of money through having access to hard currency operations and so on. They turned to these young entrepreneurs, the young wolves of the Yeltsin era, to help out. And the young tycoons had proposed a deal with the devil for the Yeltsin administration. They'd lend the Yeltsin government hundreds of millions of pounds in return for acquiring control of the nation's crown jewels, the nation's oil industry, which would enable the Yeltsin government to pay off its debts to budget workers, pay pensions, and so on. And so kind of rehabilitate itself in the eyes of the population before the crucial elections in '96, when Yeltsin really needed to win. So the the young tycoons lent all this money, and after the election, Yeltsin won, but of course the Yeltsin government wasn't in a position to pay back the loan, so the young tycoons overnight suddenly won control of the nation's oil industry, and for almost nothing, for a couple of $100 million apiece, and that really broke any remaining control of the security services over oil exports. So they were pretty miffed, because this was a very important strategic cash flow for them, even though the oil industry in the early 90s was crumbling, it was riddled with corruption. They still wanted this to fund their operations, but there wasn't much they could do about it, because the oligarchs became increasingly powerful after they got hold of the oil industry, so powerful they were dictating decisions to the Yeltsin government and so on. And in their midst, there was this banker called Sergei Pugachev. He was the owner of a Mezhprom and he had a very low profile in those days indeed, but he worked closely with Pavel Borodin, who was head of the Kremlin property department, for whom Putin worked when he first moved to Moscow in '96. Putin was put in charge of the foreign property department, and the foreign property department was indeed bankrolled by Pugachev's Mezhprom Bank. So they worked together really, really very closely, even though Pugachev, he was little known, but we know of his closeness with Borodin. That's documented in photographs and other documents and so on. And also in the telling of Yuri Skuratov, who was the prosecutor general at the time. He's also spoken about this close relationship between Mezhprom Bank and Pavel Borodin. Yes, as you mentioned, the Yeltsin family after '96 got increasingly in hot water. We've all heard about the August '98 financial crash, which wiped out the population savings again overnight. Yeltsin's health was failing, and then you had the prosecutor general Yuri Skuratov, who had found out about the Yeltsin family's credit cards, which had been given to them by a Swiss construction firm, which had won billions of dollars in contracts to reconstruct the Kremlin. And in his mind, these credit cards looked like a bribe. The sums involved were tiny compared to the corruption scandals of nowadays, but in those days, it was against the law for any official to have a foreign bank account. The credit cards were equivalent to that. Yuri Skuratov had already signed the order for their arrest, and they were very worried indeed. Now, Sergei Pugachev also happened to be good friends with members of the Yeltsin family, with Tatiana Dichenko and with her husband-to-be, the Kremlin chief of staff, Valentin Yumashev. And Putin, in the meantime, had been rising quietly through the ranks of the Kremlin. He was very efficient, very quiet, very unassuming. This burnished his credentials in the eyes of Yumashev, and he promoted him several times to first deputy chief of staff and then to head of the FSB. And it was there that Putin was to play a crucial role. First of all, Pugachev found a video in which Skuratov, the prosecutor, was cavorting with prostitutes. This video then found its way into the hands of one of the main TV channels, or it was broadcast on TV. Skuratov was forced to resign. Putin then stood up. This was the first time he was really noticed. He stood up on TV and said, yes, this videotape is genuine, it's not fake. My guys in the FSB have checked it. And he performed so well on TV, all of a sudden the eyes of Pugachev and the eyes of Yumashev lit up and thought, maybe this is someone who can help us. But he wasn't the first choice. First, Yeltsin had been backed into backing Yevgeny Primakov, the former foreign spy master, as his prime minister, just to get through the aftermath of the August '98 crisis. But Yeltsin hated him. He thought he was working with Skuratov against the Yeltsin family. Soon he recollected his powers and got rid of him. But Yeltsin wanted Sergei Stepashin, who also was ex-KGB, but he was a liberal. He was from the liberal Yabloko party. Stepashin was really Yeltsin's choice as his successor, but the family, Tatiana and Valentin Yumashev and Pugachev, thought, he's not strong enough, he's a bit weak, he might do a deal with the communists and hand us over. And they decided they couldn't risk it. And so Pugachev very quietly helped persuade Yumashev and Tatiana Dichenko that Putin was their man, that he was the one who was loyal and tough enough to protect them. And that they believed he was young and he was progressive. Putin was very skilled at being a chameleon and projecting what others wanted to hear from him. So he made it. But what's curious, that out of the three candidates, all three were ex-KGB. And as Yumashev said then, they felt they needed somebody who was going to strengthen the state, somebody with these stripes on their shoulders from the security services, because as Yumashev put it, he said, during the Yeltsin years, we swallowed so much freedom, we were almost poisoned by it. So they, it wasn't a coincidence that it was someone from the KGB, but it was probably an accident that it ended up being Putin. There were these little foibles and characteristics. It could have been Stepashin, and probably we'd have a much safer world now if it had been. Even Primakov would not have acted the way Putin has done.
Wow. Well, there's an alternative reality. So Yeltsin resigns early when Putin is his prime minister at the dawn of the new millennium. Very dramatic, actually, after a long battle behind the scenes. You've mentioned the daughter, who's very influential in that. And Putin comes into office. At first, nobody knows who this man is. And there's a lot of work going into making him well known and well liked by the Russian public. But the first term, up until 2004, is kind of a roller coaster of highs and lows, lots of lows actually, ominous apartment bombings that might have helped him get a grip on power, the second Chechen war, which of course establishes his power. Then there's the Kursk submarine disaster, several hostage crises. It's really like a thriller novel in some ways. He thinks about not even going on, actually promises his wife that he's not going to go on, yet he's basically kept there by his powerful new elite that he's assembling around him. So how do you understand these power dynamics in these first, sometimes rather precarious years of Putin finding his way to power, back when George W. Bush famously got a glimpse into his soul?
Yeah, I think in the beginning he was a reluctant leader, that he was in the right place at the right time, and he was sort of ambitious. He was great at being a chameleon, so the Yeltsin family really did project onto him. They thought that he was going to continue Yeltsin's legacy, and for the first few years of his presidency, he looked like he might do that. He did introduce these market reforms, the flat income tax rate, and the land privatization, and he made all these overtures to the West. He opened up Central Asia for the US military operations in Afghanistan, and he closed down the KGB's Lord's listening station in Cuba. But he was expecting favors in return from the US in particular. He thought that he would get some kind of concessions from the US in return. But when, after he opened up Central Asia, all he got back was the slap in the face from the US withdrawing unilaterally from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, I think that was a first blow for him. And it kind of turned, he was a sort of a split personality. There was part of him who still admired Anatoly Sobchak, his mentor, the Democratic mayor of St. Petersburg. Perhaps he would have listened to some of his better angels if the West had treated him a little better in those days. But he was his mindset was increasingly shaped by the security service men that he brought with him from St. Petersburg. That's Nikolai Patrushev, above all, who he made his FSB chief, who oversaw the FSB too at the time of the apartment bombings, which everyone thought, in those days, there were always a lot of questions over the FSB role, but no one thought it would be possible that Putin's security men would be willing to kill their own people. But I think we're seeing how ruthless they are now in their actions in Ukraine today. So that kind of casts even more new light on that. So Patrushev was really this kind of Cold War ideologue. He's a year older than Putin. He moved to Moscow before Putin did in '94. He always had very senior positions in the FSB and the security services. And he was the ideologue of using capitalism as a tool for getting even with the West, of restoring Russian empire, but with capitalism. He wanted Soviet Union, but capitalist. And he's this very hard talking, hard drinking, very tough guy indeed. And gradually the views of these men kind of began to shape Putin. And of course, what they couldn't allow was any challenge to their power once they gained the presidency. And the first challenge to their power came most clearly in the form of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was openly saying that he might run for the presidency in 2008. He'd been trying to buy up contingents in the Russian parliament, and he wanted to sell his oil major to the US, which would leave him with a huge amount of cash that was outside of Putin's control. So he was the first and biggest target, and as they completely subverted the Russian court system to jail him and then take over his oil company Yukos, it was apparent to all the other Yeltsin era oligarchs that the same fate could await them. Indeed, many of them were also called in for questioning over tax evasion, the same schemes that Mikhail Khodorkovsky had used. And so they knew that Putin had a hook, that they could get thrown into jail at any time. And so began this great period of subversion of the Russian economy. Putin's men took greater and greater control of strategic sways, and the Yeltsin era oligarchs were no longer oligarchs at all, because they couldn't dictate anything to the government, even if they wanted to, but they in fact had to follow orders from the Kremlin in order to hold on to their wealth.
Mm-hmm. And the second term, as you describe it, actually from 2004 to 2008, proves in many respects, I would say, decisive to what we will see from Putin when he returns to power after 2012, after his short little break as prime minister, and sets himself on the course he's still on today. So in the second term, he gets rid of the free election of regional governors. So he's beginning to roll back democratic reforms of the Yeltsin years. He finishes off more or less Khodorkovsky, as you said, the richest man in Russia, and sets an example. Finishes off is, of course, a bad word. He's still alive, at least. He, of course, sets up the Nord Stream pipeline with our former chancellor, Gerd Schröder, in his outgoing days. A lot of good that did us. And in 2007, he gives this infamous, I think in retrospect, speech at the Munich Security Conference that really describes everything we're still seeing. He's turning sharply against the West. He's complaining about America and it's wanting a unipolar world. Now the speech is getting watched quite a bit these days. It's quite far away in time by now. It's the year the iPhone got invented. Have we and our Western leaders back then have failed to take this man seriously when we could have heard his words before he could monopolize even more power in all the years to come?
Yeah, I guess it was certainly true that no one from the West wanted to hear what Putin was saying then, when he was railing against the US for NATO expansion, for putting these missile defense shields, or planning to in those days in Poland and Romania, so close to Russia's borders. He wouldn't take at all their explanation that these missile shields were aimed against Iran, because why is it located there? The missile trajectories didn't necessarily make sense to him. But he made this very kind of strong speech, but the West response was really almost, you could just completely ignore him. Like I watched the video again quite recently, and all the Western leaders are looking down at the table when he's speaking. They won't even look at him. And Robert Gates, the US Defense Secretary at the time, he was asked for comment afterwards, and he just completely brushed it aside and said, well, we've already had one Cold War is enough, thank you very much. And a sort of very dismissive, thinking, we've got much more serious things to think about, like I guess the global terror fight was still going on. But in the meantime, the whole of the West is courting Russia's money, and the Putin regime and the Kremlin. Everyone in the Western banking world, in the Western energy world, was very much willing to close their eyes to Putin's subversion of the court system, his treatment of Khodorkovsky and others who transgressed against the Kremlin. The Western economic world wanted to be on the winning side, and they wanted part of the action in the Kremlin takeover because it was a one-way bet. You knew that the Kremlin was going to win when it had so many levers of control over everyone else. So it really was I think the Strobe Talbot, the former US Deputy Secretary of State, had said that sort of Russia by that time was doomed to be a weak petro state. So everyone just wanted a piece of the wealth that was flooding out, and no one, the West, the UK in particular, welcomed the Russian billionaires' money with open arms. There were lots of IPOs in 2007. Russia's economy was booming then because oil prices had surged. There was the new middle class. And everyone in the West really quite naively believed that sort of, the growth of the middle class would mean that one day there would be a group of people who would stand up against Putin. So all the bankers said, we're doing God's work, bringing the market to Russia. And everyone also thought the more Russian companies were integrated in the West, the more that we're doing share offerings in London and elsewhere, the more these Russian companies would have to behave according to Western standards and transparency. But in fact, the opposite was happening because London had such lax regulations, transparency was minimal, and the fact was everyone was not really thinking about how many of the billionaires, the Yeltsin era ones, were in fact no longer independent. They weren't sort of working out of pure self-interest the way we'd expect Western businessmen to do, but they were now already on the hook of the Kremlin, so they could be asked to carry out strategic tasks for the Kremlin. One of them told me at that time that if he got a call from the Kremlin saying, spend $1 billion or $2 billion on this or that strategic project, he couldn't refuse. You have to comply. So you have all this Russian cash by then in the Western system. Everyone's busy making money and not really worrying about whether it could ever pose a security threat. And I think, I think the West was a bit complacent, a little bit arrogant, and of course, naive. Everyone was, the EU was expanding. Everyone was still euphoric in a way.
Mm. And before we move on to the fateful third and fourth term, I was just going to remind the audience that if you have questions for the very end and time is ticking, you can put them into the chat box and I will select one or two for the end, depending on our time management. It's a lot to cover here, people. So after an interregnum of this seemingly a little bit more cuddly technocrat, Dmitry Medvedev, who sparked lots of hopes in the West, of course, in the Obama government as well. And even darker, even more illiberal Putin takes over again, seemingly effortlessly in 2012. He hasn't relinquished power since then and will not do so, of course. We now know that. But he turns Russia fully into a simulated democracy. Parties only do competition for play reasons, more or less, to simulate free and fair elections. Election fraud is rampant, of course, to get Putin the right results. He ramps up culturally conservative rhetoric in coalition with the church, with the Orthodox Church, demonizes Western liberal values, decries homosexuality, and Russia's actual official economy, I think we have to separate it from this shadow economy you write a lot about, is actually steadily shrinking from 2011 onwards. But it no longer matters to Putin. And that's the crazy thing to us Westerners, because the economy is, of course, always the thing to come first in our political discussions. We see that now in Germany again. But Putin and his KGB elite have other things on their minds. History, of course, rebuilding this neo-Tsarist empire. So how can one man, would you say, responsible for the biggest country on earth, at least in landmass, and his close circle, afford to completely not be interested anymore in the fortunes of this huge people they run, their everyday concerns?
Well, obviously it's very different from Soviet times because Russia has made the transition to at least a quasi-market economy. And the main thing is that oil prices are still high. So even if the economy is contracting, the Russian government still has enough money to pay budget workers their salaries and to pay pensions. And the Russian people are tough, and still they've seen a huge rise in living standards over the previous decade compared to the 90s. And Putin to them still represents stability compared to the complete chaos and tumult of the Yeltsin years. So his popularity was starting to flag. Nevertheless, because of the economic contraction, because of there was a fall in living standards, and there was, when people weren't investing. So his popularity was beginning to flag. So what does Putin do? He does manage to turn it around, because there were protests that accompanied his return to power. The urban elites had hoped for Medvedev to remain on as president and to continue his more liberal vector. I think, people were getting more and more hemmed in by the fact that Putin was no longer delivering on the economy, and his ratings were the lowest that they had been during his presidency. But he turned it around in one moment by this extremely popular move to annex Crimea, which again nobody was expecting. Obviously, Ukraine had always been really important for his presidency, but he had miscalculated time and again, it seemed, on Ukraine, that he'd always taken the wrong decision politically. But in 2014, he surprised everybody by sending in his little green men to take over Crimea. It was a different situation there. There was a large Russian-speaking population, which did vote majority in favor of joining Russia. So he's able to take it over almost without firing a shot. And there's this huge surge of patriotism that we've all heard about in Russia, which sent Putin's popularity ratings soaring all over again. So he didn't have to worry about the economy then at all.
So Putin, of course, also, despite managing the country like a ruthless mob boss, of course, you've commented on that, attains this kind of czarist imperial aura that's very well media managed by his propagandists, of course. The world lets him play grand statesman quite far into his shenanigans, if I can call them that. At Sochi in 2014, of course, the Winter Olympics just before the invasion. And it always kind of falls back into this wish fulfillment daydreaming, even after the invasion, because it doesn't want to disrupt its, of course, energy dependencies. And the war back then was kind of a postmodern, hyper-real situation. No one really understood it. And so we swiftly choose to ignore it again. So how did you, back then in 2014, already very deep into the substance of Russia, of course, and its politics, think about what's further in store for Ukraine and for all of us?
Yeah, I think I was like many in the West. Everyone preferred to see Putin as being a quite cynical but pragmatic actor, that he would never step beyond certain boundaries. Yes, of course, we knew he was ruthless, and we'd seen this terrible face of Russian propaganda and these claims that the Ukrainians were Nazis, and claims then that they were crucifying babies, and just this really horrible wave of fake news that was generated and just seemed completely out of control. And then I remember speaking to a former aide to Gorbachev in sort of Russia's tactics then in taking over Crimea and threatening Ukraine more directly also with an invasion. I mean, back then they'd also gathered 150,000 troops on the border with Ukraine, but back then they stepped back. But nevertheless, the rhetoric that we heard then was very disturbing. And the former aide to Gorbachev said it was if somebody had flung open the cellar doors of the Kremlin, and the stench and the ghosts of the Soviet past had come flying open, and no one, but as you say, there was this wish on the part of the West and in the Russian elite to sort of normalize everything. So Russia had taken Crimea, but it had backed off from a threats for a full-scale invasion. In those days, Putin had listened to the technocratic wing of his government, who had warned him against a stronger reaction from the West, and the fact that he didn't have the support of the Ukrainian population to launch such an invasion. So in those days, he backed off, and he did do that. Of course, annexing Crimea was in breach of international law, and the Donbass kind of proxy battles, were also, lots of people got killed. 13,000 people died in the battle for over Donetsk and Lugansk. But of course, we didn't see any of what we saw today. And I think right up to the last moment, and also most of the Moscow elite, it seemed, thought that Putin would continue to operate according to this very cold, pragmatic logic, that he would that he was bluffing with the West, that the military buildup was an attempt to get concessions from the West over his security concerns. Again, by that time, the US had already placed a missile defense shield the year before in Poland, which is only 100 miles from the Russian border. It was really close. So there were some legitimate concerns. I think he was worried about Ukraine being fed with weapons and being trained by NATO, but none of that would have happened had he not annexed Crimea in 2014. There wouldn't have been any need for Ukraine to take on all these weapons. So, I think it's taken us all by surprise. It shouldn't have done, because all the signs are there, and in my book I'm plotting these signs and the desire to kind of restore Russia's greatness on the world stage. But no one could have guessed that Putin could have actually, it is a very reckless, and many have thought it's a suicidal move, because he's uprooted all the kind of influence that Russia had in the West. All the apologists like Schroeder who worked for him. Schroeder is the only one who remains now on the board of Russian state companies. Everyone else has resigned. Like there are all the sanctions, and the sanctions are now, of course, devastating for the Russian economy. They're devastating for the oligarchs who've spent millions building their reputations in the West. It's all been completely erased overnight. So I think, I didn't see it coming. I didn't believe he was going to do it right to the last minute.
Wow. So you've already spoken about this, but I think it's important to talk a little bit more about this kind of multi-billion-dollar black cash operations that are not just enriching Putin and his KGB buddies, but are also basically there for larger strategic goals to distract, divide, and destroy the West, more or less, in the long term, if that's possible. Of course, right now it looks less possible than it did a few months ago, but no less. The chapter in your book is actually quite terrifying about all the people that have been corrupted more or less directly by Russian black cash. And I had at some point the thought in my mind that I'm not sure which leader in Europe might not be bought by Putin. And then I thought, but that's also exactly what Putin would want me to think, right? Is that the logic it works? Right?
Well, I guess we don't know. Unfortunately, we let our standards slip a great deal over the last few decades. We see all the corruption scandals engulfing the UK Tory party, for instance, and their willingness to take donations from rich Russians who've acquired British citizenship without proper care about whether they still may have Kremlin connections. And the money that has come into sort of the Vote Leave campaign, for instance, in the Brexit referendum. We don't, in our own UK, law enforcers don't have jurisdiction to look at cash that beyond the Isle of Man or other. They can't look into the source of cash coming in from offshore havens. A lot of donations were also given by hedge funds, which don't have to disclose anything about the client's wealth or where the money is coming from. So we've left our political systems very much wide open to be manipulated, unfortunately. And these sort of the the huge money laundering scandals we've heard about in recent years of Danske Bank and Deutsche Bank, and these tens of millions of dollars in illicit cash that have been flooding out of Russia. I mean, of course, most of that money, it's just simple customs and tax evasion. But there's a very worrying data point that intersects all of these scandals, and that's the Upravlение K, the Department K of the FSB, is always overseeing all these schemes. It's always the same bankers involved, and and we see them perhaps using these schemes to layer their own cash for strategic security purposes into the West through shell companies, which in the UK don't even have to disclose their ownership. They don't have to have any real business activities. They don't have to fail taxes. So it can all be fake. So there's tens of billions of cash that is flooded into the West, and most of it is incredibly difficult to trace. And we're only beginning to see like parts of that through some of the leaks in the Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers, and so on. So we've been really far too relaxed about our own systems. And unfortunately, I guess I've said that, it looked like the reaction to Putin's invasion of Ukraine had uprooted all his influence networks. Sadly, perhaps maybe now I'm being complacent, because then I'm also reminded of the demonstrations in Berlin, in Germany, all the pro-Russian groups who are coming out in favor of the war. We still have a big problem in Europe looming very fast with the election runoff between Macron and Le Pen. And we know Le Pen has been funded by Russian money, that she was given one of her first big loans in 2013 from a Czech bank linked to Putin's oil trading friend Gennady Timchenko. So these tentacles could still be there, but they're many of them are buried quite far underground. So even the sanctions won't touch them yet, because we don't know where all the money flows are. So there's still an issue.
Yeah. And actually, I was thinking about the coming runoff when I read the chapter that, of course, you wrote about Donald Trump and his quite into the past reaching contacts to Russia. Of course, we all got hysterical about them in 2017. Maybe not you, but mass media worldwide. The talking point was Russian acid. There were lots of very dramatic stories circulating. And so I think the story you tell in the book is actually quite fresh and soberly put. I think that's quite a quality about the book overall. But I could really understand this biggest coup, I think we could say, in political terms that Putin has yet achieved by reading this. And so I was thinking, how do you look back on the Trump presidency and its Russian legacy, if you can call it that, and how in scale would a Le Pen presidency register for us in the West?
Yeah, I think, yes, for sure. Trump coming to the presidency in the US was a major coup for the Putin regime. We remember the pictures then of people, the Russian MPs in parliament celebrating with champagne. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, was deliriously happy in New York. And of course, Trump had this long-running relationship running back to Soviet times when he'd first visited Moscow in the late 80s. And he did have this great admiration for the Russians. He had his great admiration for Putin as a strongman leader. And yes, his Trump organization had taken in many billions of dollars in cash from Russian clients, and it had become a big channel for laundering some of these illicit cash flows we've been speaking about. I think we still don't know the entire answer to his the questions about his Russian links and some of the kind of more murky funding operations that will still be a subject of investigations for many years to come. But clearly what he was doing globally in terms of trying to undermine NATO, tear up the alliance between Europe and Europe and the US, and and pulling out US out of the Middle East, leaving a power vacuum there. These was all music to Putin's ears, and I guess we have to consider what might have happened had Trump been president for a second term. And John Bolton has spoken about that in the US. He has said that he believes Trump would have taken the US out of NATO had he won a second term. And of course, that would have opened the way much further for Putin to act even more aggressively in Ukraine. So yeah, that could have been quite disastrous consequences indeed, because obviously the West has been able to react with a great deal of unity over the invasion of Ukraine. I think Putin has been surprised by the strength of the sanctions, though he has operated quite neatly to try and make sure that the oil and gas revenues are still coming in, which are through which he's able to continue to prop up the ruble. But obviously, if Marine Le Pen now wins the French election, that could upset the apple cart all over again, because there might not be such cohesion in Europe on sanctions anymore. We don't know, there might not be such cohesion in the overall approbation of Putin's actions there. We might see a new wave of apologists for what he's doing there. And one country goes, you don't know when the next ones will fall as well. So yeah, it's a very dangerous moment indeed.
Oh yeah, I think that's a powerful ending to this conversation. I have picked 2 audience questions, if I may post them to you.
Thank you.
And before that, I have also posted into the chat, if anyone's interested, the current episode of our podcast, Carl & Company, because I talked to Joshua Jaffa, the New Yorker's correspondent in Moscow, and he's just been in Kiev for a month, and I've talked to him about what he's experienced there. So you can find links to Spotify and Apple Podcasts in the chat, and I know you've also done events together, so I thought that might be fitting.
No, that's great. I'd love to see that.
And I'm asking Luca's question, who wrote to me: how did Putin turn from a progressive KGB agent in Dresden, who obviously collaborated with the West because he anticipated the breakdown of the old Soviet system, see early chapter of Miss Belton's book, footnotes are always important, turn to someone who calls the West now the root of all evil and is obviously suffering from an Americaphobia? Just today he accused America to lead a proxy war. Okay, yeah.
Okay, good question. So I think, yeah, to some degree, yes, he cooperated with the West to some degree, but he was in those days, he was progressive in that he thought that communism was failing the Russian Empire, and that he knew that Russia had to undergo this market transition in order to be able to continue to compete economically against the West. So I don't think he ever saw the US or the West as anything other than the main adversary, although in the first years of his presidency, as we spoke about, he was willing to make some concessions to the West, and he even spoke about Russia one day joining NATO. But I think it was this gradual process of attrition when the West continued to act rather arrogantly and ignore his security concerns. He felt that he wasn't treated with respect, and that the West was arrogantly kind of pursuing its own goals and believing Russia was a basket case that didn't matter. And so he was a bit, I think, Barack Obama during the Medvedev presidency said that Putin was a bit like a naughty schoolboy at the back of the class, waving his arms, trying to get attention, and probably that's a type of behavior is exacerbated when Obama again called Russia no more than a regional power. This only winds Putin up. So unfortunately, we've seen him act aggressively to, in his eyes, restore Russia's standing on the world stage. This has always been the driving aim of his presidency, But unfortunately, he could have done that through kind of building a competitive and strong economy. But unfortunately, he's resorted to the KGB tactics of the past, first through launching these black operations to undermine rivals in the West, and now in its more kind of aggressive form and very open form, this invasion of Ukraine, which has shocked all of us. But I think, yeah, the West does share the blame, because we have, we closed our eyes to his crackdown on human rights. We continue to take the money of the Kremlin regime. Western economies have benefited a great deal from the flood of money that's been coming out over the last 2 decades. And we didn't ask enough questions, at the same time as ignoring any security concerns that Russia might have. And I do think that they were legitimately worried about the NATO training that was going on in Ukraine, but that was a consequence of Putin's annexation of Crimea. So it just has all spiraled out of control, unfortunately.
And I'm going to combine 2 questions to one, because I think they fit well together, so that everybody has still a bit of evening left, and you as well. Christina asks if Alexei Navalny could play a role in overtaking power in Russia to reestablish democracy there. I think that's going to be a disappointing answer, but I'm going to let you answer it. And Simon asks you, in the 1990s, there was talk of Russia joining NATO. Why was this chance not seized, and who was against it?
Yeah, I think, yes, unfortunately, the Navalny answer right now, it has to be short, because of course he's in jail. He's just been sentenced for an even longer prison term. It's unlikely in this current environment, when Putin is cracking down on any dissent, when you face a 15-year jail sentence for just criticizing the war, that Putin is going to let him out anytime soon. So I think the source of overthrow is maybe first from maybe within his own inner circle, from people who are upset at Russia's economic isolation, its pariah status. If the war does not go well for Putin, if he's not able to turn it around after this change of tactics, focusing on Donbass, then he could face a backlash. The overthrow of Putin might come from inside, and then maybe Navalny will be freed, but it won't be him who is taking over power or re-establishing democracy, unfortunately. Or we may have to wait a longer time if somehow he's successful in his war, in which case, we have to wait for the sanctions to maybe go on for years before the population really does begin to rebel at the drop in living standards. We just don't know. So I think it's kind of crucial what happens in Ukraine in deciding much of this, unfortunately. In the 90s, of course, it was a different era, and I think the West was very short-sighted in its approach to Russia. I think there was, many of the Russians I've spoken to have said, why wasn't there a Marshall Plan? We should have had a Marshall Plan. But obviously what happened in Russia at the Soviet collapse was very different to conditions after the end of a world war. But Russia believed that perhaps there should have been more investment. I'm not sure. I mean, there were the IMF loans, but much of the IMF money was stolen. So I think there was just a great deal of distrust on both sides, unfortunately. And I think the West to some degree was very keen to speed Russia's transition to a market economy. But again, Russia was so vast, and its government too so vast, that even the so-called young reformers in government that the West so adored, Igor Gaidar and Anatoly Chubais and co, they were in a minority. And you still had these Soviet hardliners in the background, like Viktor Gerashenko, the central bank chairman, and Viktor Chernomyrdin, who were pursuing the old policies of the past. So the entire transition was really corrupted. So I think it was very difficult. I'm sure there was a missed opportunity, but I think the levels of corruption and the lack of trust on both sides made it almost impossible. There would have had to be some very, very far-sighted, far-thinking politicians in charge on both sides to make that possible.
And if I may pose you one last question from the chat, because it's quite interesting to me as well. And I haven't asked it, but you can provide a short answer if you want to. Christina asks about your extremely interesting interviews with prominent figures. And she asked if it was easy to reach out and if there were others who didn't want to speak to you.
Yeah, I think when I was researching the book, you know, I kept a pretty low profile, and I was able to, you know, maintain contacts with the people that I'd spoken with while I was at the FT. So I was speaking to them mostly, first of all, when I was in Moscow, but then after the first Ukraine standoff in summer 2014, they began becoming much more wary about meeting with me. And so at that point, I left and went back to London, where I found people like Mr. Pugachev and others who were very interesting and had very interesting insights. But I did continue to speak there with my old contacts from Moscow, because they were coming in and out of London, and more kind of more comfortable in speaking with me there because there was nobody watching, or at least they thought there wasn't. So trying to think who. So yes, Yuri Kovalchuk didn't want to speak to me. I tried to speak to him many times. He was a definite no. I would not like to say too much about others for giving the game away about those who did speak to me, because there were some anonymous, surprising ones who did speak. So I won't go through who did and who didn't. But, you know, there was a very, I felt very grateful and lucky to be able to speak to quite a wide range of people. And so even after Ukraine, even after the standoff with the West, there were people from within the Kremlin who were still speaking with me. One of them was on the record, and that was Vladimir Yakunin, who is the close Putin ally from St. Petersburg, also ex-KGB. And it was tremendously valuable to speak to him and to gain insight into the views of the Putin era security men. So I spent an awful lot of time doing my research because it was so much fun speaking to everyone.
Fun is one word to put it. So more questions are trickling in. We cannot get to all of them. I would just like to read to you a comment that Luca made in a message to me. He said, I admire Miss Belton. She's a very brave journalist and made excellent research. So I think that's a very good point to end on. The book, again, is Putin's People, or Putins Netz. It's available in all bookshops in town, and two of them, Rombach and Jos Fritz, have gotten quite honorable amounts of them there. I've checked myself, so you can rush out tomorrow and get it. Of course, sadly not signed because we're doing an online event. I would like to thank all of you who participated. Of course, it's the first very nice night out, good day of spring, so very good of you to tune in. The event is, of course, free. If you would like to contribute to our programming, there's bank stuff in the email you've gotten with the Zoom link. We always appreciate €5 to keep it going, but it's, of course, a free event still. And most of all, I would like to thank Catherine Belton for speaking to us about this fascinating book and for giving her valuable time to us tonight. Thank you, Catherine Belton.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the wonderful questions. I've really enjoyed chatting to you. So thank you so much. Thanks.
Me too. A good night to everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for joining. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye. Have a nice evening.
You too.